let's start with the last session. So my name is Atul Deshmukh. I'm a group leader here at CBMR. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our next distinguished speaker, Professor Lisa Chow from University of Minnesota. So Professor Lisa is a director of Division for Diabetes and Endocrinology. She's also a director for NIH-funded diabetes research training program at University of Minnesota. So among her several accomplishments, she is also an associate editor for Diabetes Journal. So if you are interested in submitting something to diabetes, you can talk to her. And she's also has been a reviewer for NIH and ADA funding applications. She is actively engaged in the clinical research, so she sees patients basically every day, and she's very much interested into how lifestyle modification can be used for treatment and prevention of diabetes. And today she's going to talk about importance of time-restricted eating. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Lisa.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Atul, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Julian, for inviting me to come give a talk today. So what we will do is kind of along the idea of fasting, but this time in very much human studies. So what I like to say is, let's forget about calories and focus on the time, the role of time-restricted eating in human studies. Now, you might have heard this as intermittent fasting. There's different fasting regimens. Some of them are alternative day fasting, where you eat some days and you don't eat others. Some of them are like 5-2 programs, where you eat normally 5 days a week and you don't eat for 2 days. What I'm talking about is time-restricted eating, where you eat every day, but it's actually a limited eating window per day. Oh. Okay. So this is the outline of my talk. I will talk about the rationale behind time-restricted eating, really focus on the evidence for time-restricted eating in humans, including some of our unpublished work, the timing of the eating window and whether it matters, and it does, and practice implications, just so you can have some take-home messages. Now, humans have been hunter-gatherers for about 2 million years plus, meaning you ate what you killed. And only starting about 15,000 years ago, they started domesticating animals, which I learned domesticated pigs is a very big deal here in Denmark. So that was one thing I learned here. About 10,000 years ago, they started having permanent agricultural communities. And really the take-home message is that the human body has evolved from 10,000 year plus to be in a fed fasting state. And that readily available food has actually been a recent phenomenon. And what we see is that people are constantly eating. This is some work that Sachin Panda had done. He created an app. Oh, let's try this. He created an app, and this app is freely available. So if you go to Apple Store or Google Play, you can download it. He uses it for research, and I have had the fortune of collaborating with him so that we can get all the raw data about dietary habits. But at any rate, he created this app, and he had 150 people document all food intake for 3 weeks. So people ate, they took a picture, they said what it was, you had a picture, time, date stamp, what did you eat? And you can see here, each black dot represents an eating occasion. And, oh, I get that, okay. So what you can see is generally around 8 a.m., there's a higher eating. Around noon, there's a higher eating. Around 6 p.m., there's a little bit more eating. But the thing that is more pronounced is that black dots are everywhere, even between midnight to 6 a.m. So people are actually constantly eating. And when you look at the eating window, meaning the first time you put something in your mouth versus the last time, about 50% had an eating window of greater than 15 hours. So really, people actually only stop eating when they're asleep. That availability of food really makes people eat. I kind of get to that environment question that was actually raised a bit earlier. And what we have seen in some of our unpublished work is that no matter what ethnicity you are, your eating window is generally about 14 to 15 hours. And what we had published is that your eating window actually very much correlates with BMI. And you can see here the baseline eating window. When you have it around 18, the BMI is about 40. When your baseline eating window is about 14, it's about 25. So whereas caloric restriction focuses on limiting calories, the concept of time-restricted eating focuses on limiting the eating window. There are many time-restricted eating regimens, but the most common regimen is it's about an 8 to 10 hour window, and the most common ones that you see are about 8 to 10. So when you hear that 16-8, that's what it is. 8 hours eating, 16 hours fasting. What's interesting about time-restricted eating, though, is that it tends to be fairly agnostic to food quality and preferences. So at least in our studies, we tell them you have your 8-hour window. During that time, you eat whatever you want. But outside that time, we only allow water and actually medications. So what is the evidence for time-restricted eating in humans? It actually has been around for a long time. For about 2013 to 2022, there were about 40 studies of TRE in humans in various shapes and forms. Generally, these were small. They were typically not randomized. That's why they didn't have a particularly high profile. And it suggests that time-restricted eating can reduce caloric intake by about 5 to 20%, and resulting in modest weight loss of about 3 to 5%. And sort of this work to date had been reviewed, again, in a review article that I had been a co-author with Sachin Panda. But a common question I get is that I thought time-restricting eating doesn't work. And the reason why is because of these two major studies that were published in 2020 and more recently in 2022. So let's talk about why these studies have suggested it doesn't work, and then I'll talk about studies which suggest that it might. So the first study is by Ethan Weiss out of UCSF. And what this study showed is that they compared time-restricted eating versus unrestricted eating. It was about 105 people. They did not have diabetes. They had a 12-week study. And what was interesting is half the people were done remotely, so meaning they never came to the clinical center for evaluation, and the other half were people from the Bay Area. So only half people actually had in-person measurements. On average, the age was about 47, the BMI was 33. They had no diabetes, and interestingly, no eating window measurements. They were randomized to either a control group of 3 structured meals a day or a designated eating window of 12 to 8. And outside that window, they did allow water, zero-calorie drinks, so meaning Diet Coke is okay. We don't do that in ours, but he allowed it in his, and well as coffee with caloric-free sweetener. Most notably, they used this app, and with this app, all they had to do every day was say, yep, I complied with an 8-hour window, or no, I didn't. And likewise with the control group, yep, I complied with the 12-hour, the 3 meals a day, or no, they didn't. So there was actually no measure of eating window. What they found in this study is that in the control group, you can see that the weight change was about 0.07. And with TRE, they did lose weight. Okay, so they did not change. With TRE, they did lose weight. They lost about 1 kilogram, and that was significant compared with baseline. But when you compare between groups, it was not significant. And this is their waterfall plot of individual participants on the y-axis and weight loss on, individual participants on the x-axis, weight loss on the y-axis. You can see it's a big diversity, and maybe a little bit more with TRE. So what they concluded is that TRE did reduce weight relative to baseline, that this was not significant compared to control. It was actually associated with a little bit of lean mass loss, but we do know when people lose weight, they do lose fat mass and lean mass. And it was actually not associated with any alteration in glycemic measures, but these people did not have a history of diabetes. The main criticism of this study was the self-report of time-restricted eating. So the change in eating window was actually unknown. Only 50% had an in-person assessment. And again, when they had the fasting period, you could actually drink all the Diet Coke you want or the Diet Mountain Dew. And so there are concerns that even though these do not have calories, that they might affect appetite and what you're eating. So those are sort of the main concerns about this study. This is another study that came out of China in 2022, published in the New England Journal. And this was a big study. It had about 140 people, of which 120 completed. It was a 1-year study. Average age 32, BMI 32, no diabetes, baseline eating window here of 10 hours. So in China, in this study, it's very much different than the 15 we see in the United States. Everybody was on a caloric restricted diet. And the question was, were they on a caloric restricted diet over 12 hours, or were they on a caloric restricted diet from 8 to 4? So that was their eating window, but everybody had a caloric restricted diet. They did allow non-caloric beverages during fasting. They did document everything using a mobile food record. They met regularly with a dietitian every 2 weeks for the first 6 months and then monthly. And the primary outcome was weight change compared with baseline. What they see here, is this better if I do that? It's probably better if I do this. Okay. What they see here is that this is the time on the x-axis, absolute change in weight on the y-axis, and you can see that they actually had similar amounts of weight loss. In fact, both groups lost about 9 kilograms, and this is actually quite significant. So what they found, of course, no significant group differences, that both groups improved blood pressure, lipid panel, possibly glycemic measures, but there's no history of diabetes. And what they concluded is that in the setting of caloric restriction, time-restricted eating on top of that did not provide any added value. So again, the main study criticism here is that everybody had significant caloric restriction, and there was actually a minimum change in the eating window. They had an 8-hour window, so they went from 10 to 8. So then the question is, okay, these two studies are out there. Does it actually work in humans? And the way to think about it is there's different ways to compare this. You can do TRE versus non-TRE. That's sort of the original work. TRE versus caloric restriction. And then TRE timing, early versus late. So we will go through the literature in all three areas. I had mentioned Ethan Weiss's work earlier. Let's talk a little bit about my paper, which was actually published about 6 months before Ethan's work. Back to the My Circadian Clock. The reason why we use this is that it serves as a mobile food record. And you basically, instead of writing things down, you document everything using your phone. And for our studies, we wanted people who are good trackers. And so you can see here, this is an example of an eligible subject here. Each green actually represents an eating event. Actually, a red represents water. And you can see this is somebody who was a good tracker and had an eating window of about 13 hours. This is somebody who is not an eligible subject, and therefore we did not have this person in our study. So really, we use this as a screening before they could be in our study. The reason why this is important is that during our studies, everybody had to track everything they ate for 12 weeks. And our dietitians would look on the back end because we had free access to the data and let them know if they were compliant or not. So you can see this is baseline, this is example of end intervention, this is the same person, and you can see how this person went from a 13-hour eating window to an 8-hour window. So every week, our dietitian would look on the back end, they would see this, and they would either call them or send a text reminding them to keep that 8-hour window. So that way we can maintain real-time, ongoing monitoring. So in our study, ages 45, BMI 34, no history of diabetes, baseline eating window of about 15 hours. We had 20 people randomized to either time-restricted eating, they picked a window, they had to stick to the window, or unrestricted eating. And what we found is even though we asked them to pick an 8-hour window, so they picked, let's say, 10 to 6, 11 to 7, whatever they wanted, but they had to stick to it, they actually came up with a 10-hour window. So really, even though you ask for an 8-hour window, you get a 10-hour window. And this is the documentation that we had. And what we can see here, each blue-orange pair is a participant. Orange is baseline, blue is end intervention. This is non-TRE, this is TRE and below. And you can see some people are good trackers, some people aren't. But that way you can sort of see how they're doing over the course of the 12 weeks. So what happened? So just by giving them that simple prescription, A, you have to track everything you eat, and then B, you had to stick to an 8-hour window, people lost weight. People in general lost about 3.5 kilograms, and about half was lean mass, half was fat mass. And as you can see here, this weight loss was significant compared to baseline as well as the control group. And based on DEXA, you can see this is the sort of the distribution of the weight change. Further secondary analysis showed that TRE seems to reduce snacking and caffeine intake. Interestingly, a lot of people didn't eat breakfast anymore. As hinted before, when you do an 8-hour window, you often skip breakfast, so they actually drank less coffee. That there's a possible improvement in sleep duration, but not sleep quality. We did have them wear actigraphy. to look at their activity level as well as sleep. And we also did sleep questionnaires. And part of what we were thinking is that if they weren't eating before they go to bed, would they have better sleep? And the answer seems to be no. But we did look at that. And also in healthy humans, there appears to be no effect on beta cell functions. But again, these people did not have diabetes. So what about comparing, and this is much more recent work, about comparing time-restricted eating versus caloric restriction. And for that, we will talk about 2 papers by Krista Veraday, and then our own work, which is unpublished. So this is work that Krista had published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. This is a big study of about 77 people, time-restricted eating 12 to 8, so they mandated 12 to 8, 25% caloric restriction or control. And that was for the first 6 months. And then for the second 6 months, it was 10-hour window, 15% reduction or control. Age 40, BMI of about 40, no diabetes, baseline eating window of 10 hours. And what Krista found is in the control group, not much happened. And with both TRE and caloric restriction, they had similar weight loss. 3.5 for the TRE, 4.3 for the caloric restriction, and that it was similar loss of lean mass, fat mass, and visceral fat. There was actually no difference in glucose, blood pressure, or lipid measures. So what she concluded is that TRE appears to be similar to caloric restriction in terms of weight outcomes. What about people with diabetes? And this is probably the biggest study to date comparing TRE to caloric restriction in patients with type 2 diabetes. And she just published this again in 2023. Age 56, BMI 40, hemoglobin A1C of 8.1, and a third were on insulin. And so this was a 6-month study of 75 people, 8-hour eating window, 25% caloric restriction or control. And what you see here is that with TRE here, they lost about 4.5 kilos, which was significant compared to baseline and control. The caloric restriction is 2.6 kilos. The control lost about 1.7 kilos. And that TRE had a preferential loss in fat mass. Interestingly, the change in hemoglobin A1C, as seen here, also in figure B, was similar between the 2 groups. And when you look at the continuous glucose monitor, that both had similar reductions, whereas the control group went up. And what they concluded is that TRE had similar, if not slightly better benefits than caloric restriction in patients with type 2 diabetes. So now this is our work. So this is all unpublished, fresh off the press. You're getting the fresh stuff. And if you're wondering, did Krista scoop me? The answer is yes. But we think about things so different. You know, it's all part of science, so it's all good. And so what we had is we had a study supported by this R01 comparing an 8-hour eating window versus 15% caloric reduction versus unrestricted eating for 12 weeks. And we were actually interested in the possible benefits of prolonged fasting. The TRE studies in animals have been amazing. And so the question is, in humans, does prolonged fasting make a difference above and beyond caloric restriction? What we did do is rather than Krista having them pick a 12 to 8 window where they had to stay with it, we let people choose their own window that they would stay with, and we tracked everything using the MCC app. So this was our conceptual model. TRE with as much as you want during the 8-hour window leads to daily prolonged fasting. And we thought that maybe this daily prolonged fasting might alter diet, it might enhance fat oxidation, it might enhance metabolic flexibility with the concept if you have prolonged fat, you'll preferentially prolonged fasting, you'll preferentially burn fat, and that this will result in maybe preferential weight loss, preferential reduction of fat mass, maybe improved insulin sensitivity. So this is our study, and again, this is all unpublished, but we just finished it, so hopefully it will be published this year. We invited people to use the app for the week. We brought them in, if they qualified on the app, for a CGM, continuous glucose monitoring and actigraphy to look at their sleep and activity and baseline labs. We did a visit where we looked at their body composition by MRI and DEXA. We removed the sensors. We did an appetite survey. We did a 24-hour dietary recall, so we had sort of an objective measure of what they were eating. We then brought them in for a clamp visit, which I'll show in the next slide, where we looked at their fat oxidation. We did indirect calorimetry. We then randomized them to an 8-hour window, caloric restriction unrestricted eating. They did this for 12 weeks, and then we repeated everything at the end. So I think this is much more detailed and much more metabolically focused, so therefore how this will add literature compared to what is out there. So this is our clamp for people who are interested in clamps. I know you guys do clamps here. We did give them a study-provided meal at 6 to 8 p.m. so that no matter what group, TRE or caloric restriction or control, everybody got the same meal. They came in the next morning. They were there for about 8 hours, of which the 6 hours was the clamp. We gave 6,6-2H2 glucose, U13C palmitate. This is to measure hepatic and muscle insulin sensitivity. This is to measure free fatty acid breakdown. We did indirect calorimetry 2 hours into this to look at their resting energy expenditure and their RQ. We then did a low-dose clamp to assess hepatic insulin sensitivity and also to measure free fatty acid breakdown. And then we did a high-dose clamp to measure insulin sensitivity. And no, the stable isotope stuff is not available yet. We just shipped out the samples to Brian Bergman about a week ago, and so we hope to get that back. And so this is exciting data that we don't have yet. We do have the overall glucose infusion rate and the M value from the clamp. We just don't have the stable isotope data. This is our study, and I'll just kind of walk through this because I understand this is small print. We screened 115 people. 88 were randomized. 30 were to time-restricted eating, 29 to caloric restriction, 29 to unrestricted eating. And if you look at the people who completed the primary outcome, which was the weight, it was 29, 26, 26. So we finished the study in October. Well, these are the results, just the baseline results, age 43, BMI 36, no history of diabetes, baseline eating window of 14 hours, baseline caloric intake of about 2,300 kilocalories, and you can just see all the data that we sort of collected on them on baseline. From the 24-hour dietary recall, their caloric intake, healthy eating index, body composition, the glycemic measures, hemoglobin A1C, M value, which is a measure of insulin sensitivity, the continuous glucose monitor, and then the sensor data for activity and sleep and lipid profile. This is the change in weight loss by individual participants with TRE, caloric restriction, and unrestricted eating. You can see, again, on the x-axis, individual participants. On the y-axis, the weight change in kilograms. If you're thinking there is a control person who lost 15 kilos, yes, there was. That's what happens when you work with human data. But this is our unadjusted data. I'm honest, I'm honest. Hurts, but I'm honest. All right. So anyways, if you look at the weight change, what happened? We found that with people in a TRE, they lost about 3.7 kilos. Caloric restriction lost 4 kilos. Control lost about 1.6 kilos. So this is before intervention. This is after intervention. This was the 12-week intervention. And then if you look at the different measures, I'll kind of go through this in detail. So the way to think about this table is that these columns are the change compared with baseline, and this here is the p-value, if it's in yellow, is basically significant compared to between groups. So this is TRE versus caloric restriction, TRE versus control, caloric restriction versus control. And really the take-home message here is that they had similar amounts of weight loss between the two groups, even the control lost a little bit. If you look at the eating window, we measured the eating window 2 ways, by the MCC app as well as by a 24-hour dietary recall. You can see that TRE really reduced the eating window by about 5 hours here and 3 hours according to this measure. Even in these two groups, they reduced the eating window, but we think it's related to people just getting tired of tracking their food intake. So you can, because you don't see that reduction here in the 24-hour dietary recall. What we also saw is that even though time-restricted eating and caloric restriction lost similar amounts of weight, the intervention time was quite different, namely that the dietitians spent about 15 minutes less in the TRE group than the caloric restriction, and over the course of the 12-week study, about 100 minutes less. So really, even though they had same amounts of weight loss, they actually spent a lot of time. If you look at the daily caloric intake, only TRE actually significantly reduced daily caloric intake by about 400 kilocalories. The caloric restriction reduced their intake by about 270 kilocalories, but this was not significant because the confidence interval did span 0. And if you look at the effects on their diet, such as sugar-sweetened beverages or healthy eating index, it actually did not change across any of the groups. So it seemed like in TRE, they just ate less because of a lower opportunity to eat When you look at body composition, again, if you look at the differences between groups, it wasn't significant. But if you compare the baseline, both TRE and caloric restriction lost body fat as measured by DEXA and by MRI. Maybe caloric restriction also lost a little bit of hepatic fat. The control group gained a little bit of visceral fat as measured by DEXA. If you look at the glycemic measures, hemoglobin A1C, insulin sensitivity by HOMA, or by M values, no difference between the groups. And if you look at metabolic flexibility, maybe it actually increased in the caloric restriction group. I expected the TRE, but it actually increased here. But the difference was essentially negligible. If you look at the continuous glucose monitoring measures, the main findings here is that there was no change between the two groups, but in the control group, they had less time within range and more time above range, meaning that in the caloric restriction group, they had generally higher sugars, but their overall average sugar wasn't different. What was interesting is when you looked at the actigraphy data, the people in the TRE seemed to be a little bit more active. They had a little bit more light activity compared to baseline, whereas the other two groups did not change. And there was no effect on sleep or blood pressure. If you look at the resting energy expenditure in terms of metabolic rate, it significantly decreased with caloric restriction. This has been seen in other studies, and maybe they reduced triglycerides. But again, if you look at these values here, comparing between groups, it's pretty much unremarkable. What was interesting is that if you look at what is it, if you increase your eating window by 1 hour, does it make a difference? And remember, we measured the eating window by the 24-hour dietary recall or by the MCC app. And probably the take-home message is that in the control group, every hour longer of the eating window, they gain more fat mass. They did not gain weight, but they gained more fat mass. And that in the control group, every hour longer eating window, they had higher caloric intake. Didn't see that for the TRE or caloric restriction group. And so really, it seems that if you're in your natural state and you're just eating, the increase in the eating window is associated with higher caloric intake and higher fat accumulation. So going back to my conceptual model, which was good in theory. Okay, so the TRE with ad libitum intake, did you have daily prolonged fasting? The answer is yes, we did that. Did it alter diet? It did not alter diet. Did it enhance flexibility? No, TRE did not. Maybe caloric restriction did. Did it enhance fat oxidation? We don't know. The stable isotope measures are still pending, but the RQs didn't change for TRE. Did they lose weight? Yes, but not that different compared to caloric restriction. Did they preferentially lose fat mass? No. TRE was not associated with a preferential loss of fat mass or improvement in insulin sensitivity. Again, what we did see is that TRE was associated with about a 4-kilogram weight loss, similar to caloric restriction, and that this was associated with less dietitian time, about 42% compared with caloric restriction. So for all of those who had a great hypothesis, only to see it not quite pan out the way you thought, this would be an example. But all is not lost. We're going to do a lot of secondary analysis to see who might benefit. So what about TRE timing? So there's been a lot of interest about TRE timing and when you pick your eating window. So there's a difference between what people pick with what works and what people should be doing. And probably the best paper on TRE timing comes from Courtney Peterson et al., Sutton et al., she's part of that group, where they took 8 people with prediabetes, age 56, BMI 32, all had prediabetes, and basically they kept them weight stable and they fed them early. So this is the way the study was done. It was 8 men with prediabetes, isocaloric, so it means the weight was stable, crossover, randomized, all food was provided, all food intake was supervised. I mean, this is a very controlled study, and it's actually a real classic when you look at early eating. And so what happened is that they were either taking over 12 hours or over 6 hours, meaning you had to finish eating by 3 p.m. And they did each of these interventions for about 5 weeks, I think with a 7-week washout. And what they did is they looked at OGTT, cardiovascular measures, inflammatory measures, hunger measures. They did not do any type of CGM or DEXA results. What you can see here is after 5 weeks, the body weight loss was similar and essentially negligible. Again, this was isocaloric, so they're weight stable. And the main thing to keep in mind is that their insulin sensitivity actually improved as based on the OGTT. Beta cell responsiveness improved. Insulin resistance, of course, decreased. And what they concluded here is that 5 weeks of early time-restricted eating, finish eating by 3, in the absence of weight loss, improved all these parameters. And this is thought to be because insulin sensitivity is better in the morning, the thermic effect of food is better in the morning, satiety is better in the morning, so this probably plays right into that. This was another study of young adults, age 23, BMI 27, no history of diabetes, 10-hour window. And this asked if you did early TRE, finish eating by 1, regular TRE, 12 to 6, or control, does it make a difference? And here, they let people eat whatever they want, as long as you stuck within that window. And what they found here is that both groups had a 4% weight loss, although early TRE seemed to be associated with less hunger, lower blood pressure, and it maybe improved insulin sensitivity. This was another paper by Courtney Peterson, and it's a little bit similar to that Chinese paper. And what they did is they took everybody, put them on a caloric restriction, but it was a caloric restriction with an early eating window, meaning that you have to finish eating by 3 p.m. Age 43, BMI 40, no diabetes, baseline eating window of 12 hours. And what they found here is that if you have caloric restriction in the setting of early time-restricted eating, you lost about 6.3 kilograms compared to just caloric restriction alone. So I think there's actually quite a bit of evidence suggesting that if you had to eat early is a very good thing. The problem is if you have people eat their eating window and you had them pick it, they don't pick it. And so this is work that we had done, and we looked at, if you can see here, in the baseline, their eating window started at 8 and ended at 8 p.m. And when we had them pick their time, they picked to start at 11, and they ended at about 6:37. So really what happens is that people pick their eating window for compliance. They typically pick to include dinner. So although early TRE is wonderful in theory, in practicality, I think it's quite hard to implement. What are the implications for practice? So what would be the take-home messages from my talk today? Number one, so the TRE limits the eating window rather than specifically eating calories. Again, everything that we did is agnostic. People ate what they want. What it probably does is that it really limits the opportunity to eat, but the effects are modest, 3 to 5% weight loss. There may be benefits above and beyond, especially when you look at early eating, especially if you really narrow the window, although there's been literature to suggest that maybe 6 to 8 is the sweet spot. When you get down to 4, there isn't much benefit for that eating window. And that the metabolic benefit beyond traditional caloric restriction is unclear based on our 12-week study. That being said, if you go 6 months to a year, there may be benefits if this is sustained. But just based on these 12 weeks, we don't see that much benefit. I think that there's a potential relevance in resource-poor areas because everything that we did was delivered virtually. We either did it by phone or we did it by Zoom. So if you want to extend to a place that maybe they don't have access to dietitians, I think this would be an excellent option. The cons is that it does not specifically address nutritional quality, so future studies of TRE are going to look at maybe what happens if you eat a high-fat diet instead of TRE. Can you really enhance ketosis? I mean, there's things to look at that way. The long-term durability is unknown. And again, social factors very much drive eating habits, and acceptability of especially early TRE remains unknown. For us, the next step is for us to data mine what we have found to see features that might be associated with TRE-associated benefits as well as our stable isotope analysis. And right now, we do have another study looking at TRE versus caloric restriction in type 2 diabetes. And if you said I got scooped, yes, I did. But hers was everybody, because people are on insulin and not, and ours is just focusing on people with just diet-managed diabetes. So there is room for many people and many findings in this world. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Oh. Okay.
Yeah, now it's open for the questions. There are 2 questions on that side.
Hello. Thank you for the nice talk. So your study got me wondering, does a TRE just help you if you're healthy to eat less calories? And then if I saw it correctly, did the TRE group had a bigger calorie deficit than the calorie restricted group? Because it was like 400 and 200, but then they didn't lose more weight, so was it actually worse?
Yeah, I don't know. But that's true. But the thing is, though, the 24-hour dietary recall is not perfect. And so it's quite large in terms of its variability. But yes, it did seem like the TRE group ate less. The caloric restriction group probably ate less too. And what was interesting is we have done further dietary quality analysis looking at like the salt intake, the carb intake. It was actually not, TRE seemed to reduce all that, but caloric restriction did not. Now, you might say, well, that means we didn't really do caloric restriction. And I think that just says is that when you try to implement caloric restriction in the clinic with a dietitian following up, it's actually very hard to implement. So,
Okay, thank you.
There was a question on the back there.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious if you captured information on satiety and hunger levels in calorie-restricted eating versus time-restricted eating. And I'm also curious if there were differences in sex-specific response and uptake of time-restricted eating.
I have not yet looked at sex-specific responses, although we did have an even split of male and female. We did look at satiety. I haven't officially looked at it, but from what I remember, the people who were doing caloric restriction felt more hungry than the people who did TRE.
Great, thank you.
Deepshika?
Hi, very fascinating talk here. Yeah, I was just wondering if you combine TRE with caloric restriction, do you see an additive effect on the weight loss?
Yeah, I presented 2 papers. The first one showed that if you did TRE and caloric restriction, but you made TRE early, there's added benefit. The other one from China, they lost so much weight with caloric restriction that TRE did not add much benefit. So I think it depends on how you do the TRE and how you do the caloric restriction. If you lose a lot, that's why I'm thinking if you do in the setting of GLPs, if you do TRE, I'm not sure if there's going to be much benefit. I think the GLP agonist will overwhelm everything. So it kind of depends.
There's a question here.
Hi, Alex Adensall, CBMR. You did a questionnaire with this. I was interested, you said they were more hungry. But did you ask them if they were more willing to do TRE or calorie restriction in the future?
We did. So actually, after they were done with the study, they got surveys at 1, 3, and 6 months asking if they're still doing it, what they recommend it to their friends and family, and what their current weight is. We haven't looked at it yet because we just finished in October and actually it's not done. I've sort of unofficially looked at it, but I haven't formally looked. What seems to be the case is that with TRE, they're happier, but they do gain the weight back. But with caloric restriction, they do keep the weight off. That's what I see, but I haven't looked at it.
There is a question on the back.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting data. You mentioned that here. You mentioned that the people on TRE did move more. Could you check when they moved? So was that the time that they gained for not having to sit down and have breakfast? Or was that actually increased locomotor activity driven by lacking calories, basically?
I guess we could. We have the actigraphy. We have the raw data. They only increased their light activity by about 2-3%. And if you look at their overall daily activity, it wasn't different. And if you look at their resting energy expenditure, it wasn't that different. So I'm not sure how much more they actually moved in an appreciable way. So that's something I'll have to look in detail. But we do have that raw data, so we can sort of look at when they are moving more.
Hi, maybe this is a funny comment, but aren't actually all families with young children on TRE because they essentially are in bed by 7? So that would
Oh, it depends
mean
on your
there are
child.
like 12 hours at least, So that would mean that those people would, when they have young children, they would lose weight.
Well, I think it depends on the child, and it depends on what happens when the child goes to sleep. Some children don't go to sleep at a proper time, and sometimes when parents put their children to sleep, they celebrate themselves and eat, and they watch TV and they do whatever they want. So I think it depends on the family dynamics.
That's not.
I will say we did an interesting study, which didn't work, of where we had families have kids do TRE. It's like a family-based therapy of TRE. And then we had everybody brush their teeth after dinner to prevent them from eating and see if that might help with weight loss, and it didn't.
Claudia?
Thank you very much, Lisa. So, a similar question in this isn't there kind of a natural experiment? And I'm not a fasting expert, but lots of people fast for religious reasons, which is time-restricted eating, right? So it's not really a weight loss intervention. So doesn't this give a clue that this is maybe not a weight loss?
So I think you're probably referring to, there's been a lot of interest in Ramadan and Ramadan fasting. And so my understanding of Ramadan is they don't eat for most of the day. And then once the lights go down, they eat. And they eat a lot. And they eat a lot of carbs. And that's actually probably not the time to be eating. And what's interesting is people do lose weight during Ramadan. And after that, they gain it back. So there is some thought that you have to keep it up. So I think a little bit depends on what they're eating when, and then whether they can keep it up.
Sure, it's just a long time where they're not eating, actually. So, but the other point I had was obviously this is easier for people who are not always hungry. So I just wonder whether there has actually been any attempt to try to, most genetic variants that are associated with obesity do act, via appetite regulation. And so the question is, can you not select people for this is naturally easier versus this may not work for people actually who are consistently hungry and find it really hard to go for such a long time without eating? You need a different strategy for those people, right?
I think that's exactly it. Who benefits the most? You saw that waterfall plot. What we did do is anybody with an eating disorder, they cannot be in our study. So we did ask for a screen for eating disorders before and they had to screen out before they could be in our study.
So maybe I can take the last question. Great talk, by the way. So the weight loss, it was really variable, right? In some people, they lose quite a lot. In some people, almost nothing, right? So when you do data analysis, instead of putting them in two group or comparing pre to post, did you look into correlation? The person who lost a lot of weight, whether it was correlated with some of the clinical measure?
Not specifically yet, but I have looked at other studies where we've exercised people, and we have found that there can be very discrepant between improvement in VO2 max and insulin sensitivity, so they don't necessarily track. So that's something we'll have to do specifically for this study. But I think it's pretty common that there's a variability and heterogeneity in terms of weight loss, insulin sensitivity, fat composition, and that's all that what we will be doing for the next year or so.
Okay, with that, let's thank Lisa. This is a pleasure for us.